you guys be attentive and welcome.
Thank you all for being here. Dr. Relics and Brandon Ramirez. I am one of our GTAs. Most of you don't recognize me. I attend the 11:30 lecture, and I lead the discussion courses of section 16 and 19 practice. So thank you all for being here. So the name of the course you are currently enrolled in is American Federal Government. But today I'll be discussing policies and factors that influence how they are made rather than the institutions and structures that make them. Right. No, you're not right. Aaron, excuse me. What's the difference between politics and government?
Government is the structures that are put in place to run the country, whereas policies and politics are what they do.
Aaron has the right idea. Government describes the what, the who, and the how. Politics describes the why. Government can be viewed as a management or administrative system. It refers to the group of people with the authority to govern a country, state, county, or city at any given time. Our type of government is a democratic republic. There are other types, such as monarchies or kingdoms and authoritarian regimes. Politics, on the other hand, refers to the activities associated with governance. It is the process used by government to govern a defined area. It is the process that members of the society use to gain or lose power and resources. Politics can be viewed like a big game, similar to the one we had last weekend that we will not speak of. You can make predictions about politics just like you can in a sporting event. Then evaluate why you were wrong, what you did right, and what you need to do better next time. You can figure, in fact, a study conducted in 2015 at the University of Kansas found that most partisan voters, those that currently identified as Democratic or Republican, act like fans in a sports rivalry instead of making political choices based on issues. What's the problem with this? What's the problem with that though? Like as far as a forming public policy, sound public policy, what's the problem with that type of alternative? Exactly. It's not a high-minded, good government, issues-based way of making political decisions. It's basically, I don't like the other side, we need to beat them. Today, I will focus on one of the key factors that affects this notion of politics we're discussing, and that's public opinion. Public opinion is broadly defined as the aggregate of the individual views, attitudes, and beliefs about a particular topic expressed by a significant portion of the population. American sociologist Charles Horton Cooley described public opinion as a process of interaction and mutual influence rather than a state of broad agreement. Cooley's position was that public opinion was a synthesis of many people's opinions from every corner of society: workers, labor unionists, communists, capitalists, Republicans, Democrats. He used all those terms in his book. We don't hear a lot about communists these days, but back in the 50s and 60s, that was very commonly used in political writing. It is a complex, according to Cooley, it is a complex, public opinion is a complex growth, always continuous with the past, and only partly united from time to time for the purposes of unified action. Cooley believed that public opinion had little to do with agreement, but was rather a collective and evolving process of thought. We can give you a couple of examples of when broad public opinion was brought together for unified action among people who may not have otherwise agreed on much. 9/11. 9/11 is a good example. That brought Americans together. Everybody was flying the flag. The partisanship kind of dropped for a little bit. Did anybody think of something else? Yes, ma'am. Pearl Harbor. Yes. We all came together to defeat the Axis powers in World War II. Problem with that, though, is ma'am.
You could also talk about outside of this context, the Arab uprising.
Arab uprising in Egypt. So how many of you in here know anything about the Arab Spring? Who of you do? Now, Leah's more of an expert on the Arab Spring than I am. But what happened, generally speaking, very broadly in the Arab Spring, is that in these Arab countries, when was that, 2014? 2011, people came together to defeat dictators in their countries, such as Mubarak and Gaddafi in Libya, some other places, I think, Tunisia. The issue is that all these disparate groups in society came together to topple these tyrannical dictators, but once those dictators were gone, all those groups looked at each other and they thought, wow, there's not much we actually agree on now that our common enemy is gone. You had moderates and liberals, and you had women and feminists, and you also had hardline Islamists who wanted to create more of an Islamic republic with those values, and they didn't agree on much. And we see a lot of those schisms still present in the Arab countries today. That's something we'll get to there. American political scientist BOP, this is kind of clear, this Goodland guy, was concerned with public opinion's impact on policy. He wrote in his seminal work, Public Opinion and American Democracy, that unless mass views have some place in the shaping of policy, all the talk about democracy is nonsense. In short, BOP supported the idea that public opinion should play a significant role in the formation of public policy. But Key's assertion here begs a couple of important questions. How exactly do Americans express their opinions on policy and politics? Remember, originally, the only house of government that was chosen directly by the people was the House of Representatives. Originally, senators were chosen by state legislatures, and the president was chosen by, it's still the same way we choose it today, actually. Very good. Yeah, you did pay attention. Excellent work. And for clarification, we choose our senators directly today, just so there's another question. How do we rely on public opinion to make policy if the public is apathetic or ignorant? Political issues are often complex, and many people simply can't or won't dedicate that much time to staying informed about politics. Political scientists have termed this concept rational ignorance. In other words, people may think, given the high cost of staying informed, I have to watch a lot of news, read a lot of articles, and in the age of lopsided news, where a lot of news outlets are partisan in one direction or the other, I have to read several different ones from several different places to actually figure out, get a fair assessment of what's going on. Many people just say, you know what? I think it makes more sense to just stay less informed and only act when it absolutely happens. Just how uninformed is the public? Anyone tell me who this gentleman is here? No, that is not Santa Claus without a beard. Could be. You got the chin for it, right? You're on fire today, sir. That is Jay Leno. Jay Leno hosted the Tonight Show on NBC for many years. I actually looked this up. He started hosting the Tonight Show in 1992, a long time ago, and I think he took a little stint in 2011, but then hosted it again until 2014. That was a long time. For a long time. Anyway, every few weeks, he featured a segment on his show called Jaywalking. Kind of see what he did there. His name's Jay. He'd be out on the street jaywalking. Where he would leave his Burbank studio and ask people on the street about topics such as science, art, or current events. The clip we're going to watch is Jay asking random people questions about governance and politics.
I think that's different about a group education home. You always have the whole place to yourself.
Tim, what do you do? I'm a security guard at the Seattle Center.
Ah, okay, now you registered to vote?
Yeah,
You are? Okay. Do you vote?
sometimes.
Sometimes. How old are
19.
you? 19, you've only voted, you only had one chance to vote.
Yeah,
Did you vote that one time?
no,
No, so you haven't voted all yet.
yeah.
How many branches of government are there?
Branches of government. I think there's several actually.
All right.
There's the Republican, there's the.
But those are not branches, those are departments.
Oh, okay, branches.
Have you ever heard of the Bill of Rights?
Yeah.
No, what is it? Pretty lengthy, that's what it is. Are you familiar with the Bill of Rights?
Yes, I am.
What are the Bill of Rights?
Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not, commit perjury. Thou shalt not, etc.
Okay, now let's say you're a security guard, you arrest somebody. They take the fifth. You heard that expression?
No,
Someone said they take the fifth?
I'm new.
Oh, you know. Have you ever taken the fifth? Yeah, what does that mean?
They're taking the first day of the week off.
So if you take the fifth, you get Friday off, or anything?
Yeah, but well, now I can start on Monday and then start, but it's a good day from the week.
Okay, so you don't have to take the fifth, that means you got the day off.
Yeah.
What is bipartisanship?
Bipartisanship,
You hear about that, you're in Congress, bipartisanship, what does that mean?
like bisexual.
It's like bisexual. Well, partisan.
Partisan.
Well, when is the next presidential election?
January.
Next month.
Yeah.
You know, you're gonna vote for next month.
Clinton is running.
Clinton is running. Because he's president. How many times already?
3.
3 times already. 4. Have you heard of the government?
Yeah.
What is it?
Right now, both papers.
What is it? Now, you feel with our government?
The government today, no.
What is the best form of government?
No government at all.
No government at all. You feel anarchy would best serve the needs of the people.
Like collective living,
Collective living, what is that?
where everyone decides the rules. Like an actual majority.
Well, how about, let's say you got a group of people together, and they wrote like a constitution. And in that constitution, they put a Bill of Rights, which would guarantee certain inalienable rights to all Americans. Does that sound like a good idea?
Yeah.
You think that's like, what's the chance of that happening?
Slim, very slim.
Any African American?
Yeah.
Any women?
I need to know.
Any women on the Supreme Court?
As a judge, yeah.
Any men?
When I usually watch TV, they do, Judge Judy.
Right. Freedom of the press.
Relatively, yeah.
Yeah, now you have some skill.
Interesting trick.
You can get in the newspaper.
Yes, I can get inside now in newsstand. I go to these because they don't like fly.
This is what makes America great.
All right. That was funny, but it was also a little frightening, wasn't it? How little people know about politics. According to the Annenberg Foundation at the University of Pennsylvania, only 47% of the public can name all three branches of government. 25% couldn't name any of the branches at all. Who here can name all three branches of government?
On your exam.
I was about to say, we should see all the hands raised. You're on fire. 63% could name freedom of speech as a First Amendment right, but only 23% could name freedom of religion. And even less than that, only 20% could name freedom of assembly. Now that we've discussed the problem of an uninformed public, I want to discuss another aspect of public opinion. Much of what the public wants is expressed in generalities. It can be difficult for the government to move general public opinions into specific policies. You see something that you don't like, you know you want to change it, but you don't know exactly what to do about it. You don't know how it's supposed to be changed, how we change it. But a good example would be the 2008 financial crisis. Riley, can you briefly explain what led to the 2008-2009 recession?
So, a big contribution, I would not like to use higher contribution, but a huge contribution was large investment banks. And so about 5 years before the Great Recession, conventional mortgages were just like, nobody could find anyone that was getting conventional mortgages, they were extremely scarce. And so the pool of the buyers and refinancers were going down for those mortgages, and banks were getting desperate. So they started lending out these like risk loans to people. So it would be people that weren't making enough money, would be unemployed, that they knew were going to default and that couldn't meet the obligations of those loans. And so they then bundled all of these risk loans into pools called mortgage-backed securities, and they were selling shares of the pools as bonds. And so once people, the borrowers, started to default, which the banks knew was going to happen, property prices dropped and people started foreclosing everywhere, which left banks and borrowers in an extremely bad position. And it was really hard to buy a house, and it was really hard to for people to stay financially stable.
Much more in-depth answer than I was expecting.
Brown's just earning extra.
That's correct. Large investment banks such as Lehman Brothers, Goldman Sachs were essentially bailed out by the federal government after making these high-risk financial transactions that Riley just alluded to. These financial institutions are involved in so many sectors of the economy and control such large sums of money that they were deemed, quote, too big to fail. In other words, the failure of these private firms would lead to catastrophe across the economy. People were mad about this. There was a social movement created called Occupy Wall Street, aimed at reforming these companies and institutions. I remember Occupy Wall Street. Day after day, the news would show clips of these people sitting out there on Wall Street. I think they pretty much lived out there. I don't know if they actually even went home. Can't imagine how sanitary they got after a while, but they did it. They were dedicated. The problem is most people saw that there was a problem, but couldn't agree on what to do about it. Some wanted to break up the banks, but that never really materialized. Congress did finally, however, pass, and the president did sign the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act, which increased regulation and oversight of banking institutions. Interestingly, Pew Research finds that support for financial regulation has been in a slow but steady decline since 2008. This leads to another quirk of public opinion. Can someone tell me what that might be? Anybody else know? Why is it that support for financial regulation has slowly waned since the financial crisis? You're on fire today, go for it.
Don't call me again. Most question.
Why is it that support for financial regulation, government financial regulation has waned since the financial crisis, which means it's gone down steadily? Well, the quirk is that when a crisis presents itself, public opinion sways greatly in one direction. But as that crisis begins to abate and we get further and further in time away from that crisis, public opinion starts to go back to the status quo. So there's a lot of support for something at first when something big and bad happens, but over time people begin to forget about it. So something can have a lot of support today, but in a year or 2 or 5, that support drops, and it's hard to keep those policies going. So, we covered some important questions surrounding public opinion. How should government incorporate public opinion, which, as we talked about, is often general and may be uninformed? We are, after all, the government of the people, by the people, for the people. Who said this? The picture's right here, guys. He's really tall. He looks 10 feet tall in this photo compared to all these other guys. And where did he say it at? And here's a hint, it was not at his TED Talk. Gettysburg Address, you guys are on fire today. So the answer to that question of how the government should incorporate public opinion that may be general and may be uninformed is best expressed by Benjamin Page and Robert Shapiro in their seminal book, The Rational Public. They assert that the key is to look at collective opinion, not so much at individuals. Aggregated public opinion is steady and coherent, reflecting rational positions on policy and government. In other words, government should consider aggregate opinion, broad public sentiment, as this can help overcome the random individual who is either uninformed or may support policies that are future. But let me clarify. Shapiro and Page, let me clarify Shapiro and Page. Steady and coherent do not mean static. They studied over 50 years of public opinion polling and found that it does reflect a stable system of values shared by the majority of Americans, but that it responds to new events, arguments, and information reported in the media. Page and Shapiro really established the soundness and importance of collective political opinion. Public opinion on some topics remains stable over long periods of time. And when I say stable, I mean relatively. What you see here is a chart from Gallup showing support for abortion from 1976 to 2022. It's noticeable how steady it is. Public opinion surrounding abortion has remained relatively stable over the years. There has been a trend upwards in the legal in all cases category. The green line, legal under any circumstances, has gone from 22 up to 35%. And there's been a steady decline in the illegal in all cases category from 21% in 1976 to only 13% today. But by and large, the largest group remains this group here in the top blue line, which is the legal under certain circumstances. It was at 54% in 1976, and it's still at 50% today. That is a pretty stable number. What does this tell us? Americans broadly support access to abortion with some restrictions. Now, up to this point, we've discussed public opinion as a monolithic concept. It is not. Public opinion can vary based on age, race, gender, geographic location, just about any other social category that you can think of. For instance, support for abortion drops with age. A Pew poll found support for abortion was highest among which age group do you guys think? Which would be what? That's expanded over the years, by the way, but yes.
I would say that.
You're right on fire today. Yes, according to Pew, their age group that they test is 18 to 29. So that group shows it's the highest support for abortion, which is at 67%. And the lowest was among which age group do you think? But this is, I found this to be interesting. Baby boomers, the 50 to 64 range is the lowest support, and that's at 53%. Still a majority, but it's at 53%, which is lower. The
That's not
65 and up. Do what? Is that boomer?
That's not boomers. It's part, that's half Gen X, half boomer.
The 50 to 64?
Mhm.
There you go.
Yeah.
But the 65 and up crowd is actually a little more supportive, according to you, which is an interesting find. The poll also found geographic differences. Support for abortion is strongest in the Northeast at 71% and lowest in the South at 53%. So maybe they're a little more engaged, a little more bonded to it. Yeah, that could be a possibility. I don't know. When I was looking through those statistics, it was interesting to see, because I didn't put all the stats in there because there's a million of them in there. But like people with children were slightly less supportive than people who didn't have children. There was a lot of geographic changes. I didn't hear, I don't know anything about the menopause. That wasn't a question that was surveyed, but there was a huge, I mean, it's interesting to go through there and just see all the different people that live in cities, obviously are much more supportive than people that live in small towns or rural areas. Yeah, it's interesting to just see how the numbers break down. But that's basically the point I'm trying to make is the public opinion is not monolithic. So when we kind of talked about it up to this point, it's not a monolithic thing. It can vary tremendously based on those factors.
The gap between men and women.
Yes,
It's actually the gap between men and women.
there's a lot in there. There's just full of chart. Now, public opinion can, in some instances, change very quickly. This graph here shows public support for same-sex marriage. Remember, in the last slide, we looked at public support for abortion from 1976 to 2022. That's a span of 46 years. This chart shows support for same-sex marriage from 2005 to 2015. How many years is that? 10. In just 10 years, support among U.S. adults for same-sex marriage has grown from a minority of 36% to a majority of 57%. That is a sharp increase in support, and that is a sharp decrease in opposition. And though there is a noticeable difference in overall support between Republicans and Democrats supported at about 65% support amongst Democrats, 34% amongst Republicans. Now, of course, this is in 2015, so this was 7 years ago. There's a whole difference in overall support, but both have been trending upwards sharply along with independence. How did this happen so quickly? Keep in mind, anybody know what North Sea, Texas is? Dr. Rowlett knows, of course. Move back there, go ahead. That's correct. So what year was the Civil Rights Act passed that outlawed segregation in public places? We covered this in lecture. So let you know that.
We covered Lawrence too.
Yes. 1964. What year did women get the right to vote? How many of you were born on or before 2003? Most of you. So in your lifetime, if you're from Texas or Oklahoma, when you were born, it was illegal for people of the same sex to be involved romantically. And how often was that enforced? Well, not very often, but it could have been. The law was actually on the books. So look at that as a backdrop, that up until 2003, we still had anti-sodomy laws on the books that made it a prosecutable crime for same-sex to be together. So how did this opinion change so quickly? The first goes back to something we discussed in the discussion on abortion. Support for same-sex marriage is very high among young people. According to the 2013 Washington Post ABC poll, 81% of those 18 to 29-year-olds support marriage, same-sex marriage, and 57% of 30 to 39-year-olds do. As these people enter the voting age population, they bring this view with them. Support is lowest amongst older people, with 44% of those over the age of 65 supporting same-sex marriage, but this number is growing. In other words, support among older generations may be lower than among young people, but it is steadily growing. So you've got a two-pronged approach. You have high support amongst young people, and you have growing support amongst older people. Now, this will go into a different topic that we'll discuss later, which is should public opinion inform public policy, and how strictly should it do so? So early on, in about 2002, 2004, 2005, there was an election here, and there were a lot of state questions asked in numerous states across the country that amended their state constitutions defining marriages between a man and a woman. And most of those amendment resolutions passed. Now, early on, that reflected public opinion because support was low. But very quickly, by about 2010, those amendments no longer reflected public opinion. So then we were left with these laws that most people, according to public opinion, didn't support. How do we measure public opinion? Not a rhetorical question. Say it louder. Polling. Scientific polling is the best way to measure public opinion. Pollsters basically just ask people what they think of certain topics, and people give them answers. And hopefully the answers are honest. Politicians and policymakers do not simply pick issues to focus on out of thin air. They use extensive polling data to fine-tune their political messaging and figure out which issues are important to voters. Polling is a big business.
I'll take attendance.
Speaking of polling, you can all log in.
Which web gives them that?
There are numerous companies out there whose entire business model relies on creating accurate polling data. But how is this done? A scientifically rigorous poll will contain three basic elements. First, it will ask questions that are as free from bias as possible. What does this mean? If I were to ask you, Aaron, do you believe people's civil liberties should be ignored and they be made to get a COVID-19 vaccine? What would your response be? You don't have to tell me. Just think about the question for a minute. What if I ask, should people be allowed to ignore public health experts who say that vaccines are effective and be allowed to not get a vaccine? Would your response be different? Or should I simply ask, should people be mandated to get a COVID-19 vaccine? The question should be as straightforward, polling question should be as straightforward as possible, clear and easy to understand, and not leading in any particular direction. Secondly, the poll will be given to a small but randomized group of people. This is the sample population. Now, if you were a rock star pollster, you would want a true measure of total public opinion, which would mean what? If I wanted to measure total public opinion in this class, what would I need to do? Yeah. Ask every person in this class if I wanted total opinion. But there's a lot of people in here. Maybe I don't have time or the resources to ask everybody. If I wanted national opinion, I would have to measure the opinion of 330 million people spread out over the better part of a continent. Kind of impossible to do. To be scientifically rigorous, a sample needs to be, so we create what's called a sample. which is where I take a sample, a small number of people out of the larger population. But I have to be careful with this. To be scientifically rigorous, a sample needs to be representative, which means that the sample needs to have the same characteristics as the larger population it is measuring. So if I want to know what OU students think about education funding, I need to ask OU students. I don't need to ask working people in downtown Oklahoma City. A sample also needs to be random. This means that every person in a given population has an equal chance of being selected for polling. If the pollster did a good job of putting together a random and representative sample, the results the pollster gets should be what's called generalizable. However, we know that real life doesn't work that way. There will always be a slight discrepancy between the sample population and the larger population. This is called sampling error. However, pollsters know this and they include this in their results. If a poll has a plus or minus 3 sampling error, this is considered a good and representative poll. How many people have seen polls on the news and at the bottom it says plus or minus 3%? That's what that is. That is the sampling error. Next, we will go over the 4 general types of polls used in politics. The first is the opinion poll. Opinion polls measure just that, public opinion. These opinions can be on political issues or topics, or can be about people, most notably candidates for office. Public opinion polls are widely used in industry as well. The movie industry uses public opinion polls to determine how good a movie's going to do. Advertising companies use public opinion polls to determine which products are going to perform best on the market and how best to market them. This type of poll is taken at the beginning. The public opinion poll is a hugely popular way of measuring public sentiment. The second type is the benchmark poll. This type of poll is taken at the beginning of a candidate's run and is used as a comparison for all future polls. Benchmark polls let candidates know where to focus attention early on in a campaign. In many instances, potential candidates use benchmark polls to determine whether they are viable in a race or not. Political parties pay attention to benchmark polls as they help the parties field competitive candidates. You may have heard the term name recognition. Benchmark polls tell candidates how much name recognition they have and what feelings are associated with their name. They can see where support is growing and waning and focus their attention on those issues. Next, we have the tracking poll. A tracking poll is conducted over time, usually with the same group of people, and gives information on how that group feels about a given issue over time. Who has heard of presidential approval ratings? Everybody should be familiar with that. This type of rating, it seems like modern presidents live and die by their approval ratings. I think I hear approval ratings on the news every day. These polls are taken over, hold on. This type of rating is a tracking poll. Those in the sample group are asked periodically how they feel about the president's performance. The last type of poll is the entrance and exit poll. These polls are taken to voters at polling locations on election day. It's pretty self-explanatory. Entrance polls are taken of people entering the polling location. Exit polls are taken of people leaving the location. These types of polls are considered as the most desirable. Why would they be considered the most desirable? Why would entrance and exit polls be considered the most desirable?
If there are basically people that are actually voting on the topic.
You're exactly right. They're valuable because they are measuring opinion of people who are really voting in person. Not people who say they're going to vote, not people who say they might vote, but then they end up not showing their signs. The last thing I wanted to mention is what many people believe is a shortcoming. Hold on, I didn't see this one. Yeah, entrance and exit polls. Okay. The last thing I want to mention is what many people believe is a shortcoming in measuring public opinion. And that is, how do we measure the strength of people's opinion? It's hard. Here we see a chart put together by Pew Research showing how important issues are to Americans. And this was conducted last year in 2021. What's the most important topic here, actually? The affordability of healthcare is actually named by most people in this poll as a very big problem at 56%. It's hugely bigger than climate change. It's bigger than the coronavirus. It's bigger than violent crime or illegal immigration. Yet how many bills, can anyone name me a bill right now that's going through Congress that actually addresses, really systematically addresses the high price of healthcare?
Well, there was the,
There's the drug, yeah. So they are working on something to help reduce drug prices. So that might put a dent in it. But according to polling, politicians should be all over this because it has huge support. Yet they're really not. A lot of times we hear things focused down in this area, which are a lot of times pet projects. So that begs the question, is your government really responsive? Is your government really taking what matters to most people into account when it forms public policy? Below, we see a serious concerns. This begs the question of government effect. So also, this form of direct democracy, so this also begs the question of direct democracy. And I wanted to touch on this before we ended. You hear the term put it to a vote all the time, right? Put everything to a vote, referendum. California has a referendum system. Oklahoma has what, a state question system, I think is what we call it here, which is basically if there's enough signatures garnered for something, it gets put on a ballot. Now, the real problem with this, though, that I discovered over the years, is that it's hard to measure how much people actually care. How much do people actually care about that issue? So you're going to go vote on something because it's sitting there in front of you. This question is sitting there in front of you. And think of whatever it might be, marijuana, it could be taxes, it could be a school board, it could be same-sex marriage, it could be abortion rights like they did in Kansas. It could be any of those things. And since it's in front of you, you get to vote on it and you get to choose, and that's a good thing. But one of the problems that's raised in public opinion is how much do you actually really care about it? How much do you actually even know about it? For some people, that could be very important. That can be a hugely important topic that matters a lot to them. For someone else, it may not matter that much at all, or they may not even know that much about it, but everybody's vote is equal. So that person who doesn't really even care that much about it or doesn't know anything, his or her vote equals just as much as somebody who's really passionate about it. And that could be a question moving forward when it measures public opinion. One issue, one proposal that I've heard thrown around is what's called policy currency, which is basically where you're given $10 and you can spend that however you want on the policies that matter to you. So if you're kind of neutral on some other things and you want your money spread out, you can put $2 to 5 different topics, to 5 different issues. If you're really passionate about one particular issue, you can put all your currency, all your voting currency towards that one issue. And at the end, instead of just raw votes, they count up the amount of currency that's being spent. Don't know if that lecture ever comes to fruition, but it's a nice concept. Public opinion is a dynamic and powerful force in American politics. And it is an imperfect measure, but it is the best tool by which policymakers can make decisions as true representatives of the people. I will leave you with this quote from Abraham Lincoln. Public opinion